Hey folks, for the horror fans in the audience, we're back again with another unsettling Jesse Makkonen title, namely the somewhat recently released puzzle adventure, Afterdream. Thanks to the review copy I received and the support of my lovely Patreon patrons, I've been able to wander through this surreal experience. Which means it's time to ask the important question, was the aftermath agreeable, or was this dream dismal? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Sometimes it's hard to tell when a dream begins or ends, to really differentiate them from reality. Enough so that a young woman feels the need to talk to someone about her recent experience, to sift through the aftermath and piece together why it felt so real. Because it did. A lucid nightmare that saw her wake in a distorted world with nothing but the dull gleam of a camera to serve as a beacon. And yet, she does not wander without purpose. Within that somnambulist haze are shades, individuals who offer curious advice, a promise for a wish to be granted. If only one were to brave the depths of the dream, and to trust despite the nightmare's surroundings. While there is a bit more to the premise than this, getting into the finer details of the journey is apt to be very spoiler heavy, an element which I try my best to avoid in these sort of reviews. What I can say, however, is that Afterdream is an oddity insofar as its storytelling, starting in a similar vein to Makkonen's earlier titles insofar as their uncanny and spooky tones, interspersed with lighter elements. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the tone lightens considerably the further you progress, and while some segments still do manage to be creepy, it's really not a consistent horror experience if that's what you're going into it for. All the same, I did enjoy the story presentation. Exploring the world and observing things does provide some decent bits of disquiet, and early on, I enjoyed the ambiguous nature of the shades and how difficult it is to figure out their overall motivations. There's also some fairly solid bits of foreshadowing you'll catch here and there, nods that feel pretty clever if you catch them early, though they are revisited more blatantly at a later juncture. Admittedly, the manner in which things become clear-cut later does dilute a fair bit of the anxiety and tension I felt from not knowing. Narratively speaking, there simply came a point where I was no longer feeling threatened, and while there were a few brief moments that lent themselves to further questions or brief flickers of anxiety, this is on the whole more hopeful. Mostly. There's definitely a sequence that wrenched at me in a way I was not expecting. As for how all this plays out mechanically, it's fundamentally the basics of puzzlers, with the details being provided through observing the world, brief chats with NPCs, and small scenes interspersed throughout the game's various regions. Speaking of which, gameplay-wise, Afterdream will likely feel quite comfortable to veterans of the puzzle adventure genre. Primarily, you'll be exploring the small venues which comprise 6 worlds, collecting objects and then using them to solve problems in an area to advance further. While this is a simple enough mechanic at its core, Afterdream does manage to add some interesting elements to the mix, primarily in the form of the camera. Our protagonist's camera has the ability to take photos of key objects, causing them to either disappear from the world or properly materialize. While this does, in a sense, add an element that might feel more akin to the scrutiny-heavy object searches of older adventure titles, there is a genuinely neat element to this, if only because using the camera obscures a large part of your field of vision. Which is to say, your ability to be aware of the world is heavily hampered whenever you need to use the camera, which creates a distinct sensation of being unsafe. I honestly loved this so much and felt it was tackled fairly well throughout the journey, even when its application was a bit more whimsical. Beyond that, your camera does have a flash that can help illuminate an area, but this isn't actually used all that much save for a very specific set of spots, being more of something you can fiddle with to better observe points of interest than anything else concrete. Admittedly, there are a few other slices of novel gameplay, puzzles here and there which provide small brain teasers. Mind you, those are fairly spaced out, and in a few instances, the primary difficulty rests more on the location of the relevant hints. Specifically, they rely so heavily upon testing a player's astuteness and how readily they might notice a subtle detail in the environment that they can come off as rather obtuse rather than challenging the player's reasoning ability. Something that is only made trickier because whilst I certainly appreciate the grimy aesthetic of the game, it does make some of the finer details tricky to point out, especially as areas grow darker. Still, I'm not going to poke at this element too heavily because, again, I do enjoy Afterdream's presentation, and on the whole, I think it does provide some interesting and legitimately disconcerting visuals. Plus, it had managed to put me on edge more than a few times because of the peripheral bits of darkness I sometimes thought I was seeing within the murk. It certainly left more to the imagination than the scare chords. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind them generally, but there's definitely moments where they wind up feeling more like an attempt at informing me I should be spooked than an effective tool in and of itself, especially when there's more uncanny noises that can be built and leaned on. Still, at least the music in this game is nice, and there's even some decent voice acting in a segment. Still, we've reached the end here, so I think it is about time I actually answer whether or not I enjoyed my time with Afterdream. And quite simply, I did. On the whole, I do think the game is carried by the story itself, because if you do want to go into this expecting a spooky, scary experience, it really didn't take me too long to acclimatize to what it did have to offer. On the mechanical side of things, the basic item collection puzzles are fairly straightforward and often just have you bouncing to opposite sides of the region to solve them. That said, I did appreciate the other puzzles you come across as they help to shake things up and provide a bit more variety. On the whole, those were the moments I looked forward to the most. That said, when it comes to my ultimate conclusion on how I'd rate this game, I stepped away with two divergent answers, one based on its merits as a horror game and one as a game in general. Simply put, if the only reason that you are picking up this game is to be unnerved, this is likely going to be a bit of a fumble, which is weird too, because the camera and its applications are a beautiful idea conceptually. Horror, I feel, is not necessarily what you know, but what you don't. And in that singular mechanic, in the limitations it imposes on a player's ability to perceive a threatening environment, it does such a great job of capturing the essence of that. The uncanniness of highlighting something that isn't there otherwise. That sense of dissonance is also interesting to play with, though the way it applies never really hits the mark. Coaxing a balloon into existence feels more adjacent to an innovation on pixel hunting than an exercise in pushing the boundaries of horror. But that's strictly for the elements pertaining to horror. As an overall experience, while my feelings were still at times mixed, such as the ample backtracking being front and center mechanically, I did enjoy the gradual unfurling of the story, and the way it culminates was both satisfying and legitimately unsettling. On that front, as a game with a story to tell, I can call Afterdream a hit, albeit one that does have its flaws. Oh, and before I forget, in case you're the sort of person who enjoys being able to bounce around earlier chapters of the game, there's only one save slot in Afterdream. Not that there's much reason to revisit earlier chapters unless you're seeking out achievements. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit the subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, there's the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. Also check the description for a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early, or just want to support the channel, and to my merch house because you can buy things like Crit Hit coffee mugs, shirts, and mouse pads. And a big thank you to our Crit Hit crew with Green Witch Babby and Andy Noted. Thank you again for being lovely patrons. That said, catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.